Okay, great. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how Chinese strategy has shaped the rare earth elements industry. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what does this have to do with culture? Well, strategy is really a part of Chinese culture. It's rooted as a Chinese tradition. Of course, before I go on any further, I do need to point out this usual disclaimer that these are my views and mine alone, and they don't necessarily represent those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, and so on. I also want to point out that the way I will be describing China's strategic thought process is the way that some of us at FMSO, the Foreign Military Studies Office, perceive them. You may actually have your own ideas, and I would be very interested to hear any viewpoints you might want to share. Now, in a monograph entitled Geothinking Like the Chinese, my colleague Tim Thomas, who's a China expert and a senior analyst with the Foreign Military Studies Office, wrote, strategy remains an area of intense focus, most likely due to its long historical roots as a Chinese tradition. He further explained that China's strategic thought process is different from that of the United States. It's more comprehensive and diverse. Within China's concept of strategy, you'll find that there are three sub-themes. The first one, sure, I know it looks like she, but it's sure, refers to the attainment of a strategic advantage over an opponent. Second, you've got stratagems. Now, a stratagem is the Chinese historical proclivity designed to mislead an opponent's perception and thinking process. And then lastly, you have an objective-subjective thought process. Now, this has two parts to it. First, the objective reality refers to material things or the actual reality. And second, subjective thought refers to the ability to manipulate objective reality. Now, I'm just setting this up here. So the game of strategy begins to evolve as nations decide which interests become requirements for the nation's survival. So it follows that the ways to get what you want are manifested as strategic guidance, stratagems, and the goal is to achieve, sure, the strategic advantage over an opponent. China's number of perceived national interests and strategic orientations continue to grow. We constantly see them evolving. And this strategic orientations, these orientations can be found in the country's initiatives to continue to develop and grow its economy. China's objective can be linked to both internal or external development, factors, or both. For example, one of China's internal objectives might be to maintain social stability. External objectives might be to continue its economic growth and military growth, as well as securing access to reliable energy sources. Well, in the case of rare earth elements, yes, I am getting to rare earth elements, you're going to see how they fit within both China's internal and external objectives. Rare earth elements are important to energy. They're important to military technology. They're important to China's economy. And they can even be viewed as another tool to maintain social stability. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how the strategic concept is applied to the rare earth industry. And you're going to see how China, once gaining the strategic advantage, is willing to apply certain tactics, such as market manipulation, blackmail, and so on, to gain the upper hand. This is the slide. In this slide, this is the model that I'm going to be referring to when discussing China's strategy and how it fits into the rare earth elements industry. You begin with the objective reality that China has become the only nation to have an industrial component for rare earth elements, and I'll be going through this here momentarily. This gives China a strategic advantage, and then the country can use its strategic advantage to further its goals through the subjective use of stratagems. Okay, like I said, we'll come back to this in a bit, but for now, keep this, I just want you to keep this particular model in mind. So what are rare earth elements? Well, they're a group of metals known as the lanthanides found on the periodic table of elements. I'm sure you probably remember that from your school days. The highlighted group down there in yellow on the bottom, actually number 57 through 71, those are known as the lanthanides. But they also include scandium and yttrium, number 21 and 39, because of their chemically, there's very similar properties. Okay. They have unique chemical, optical, luminescent, and magnetic properties that can make them ideal for hundreds of high-tech products, ranging from everyday devices, your cell phones, your laptops, your iPods, and many more, to green technologies. Okay, green technologies are actually the biggest consumers of these rare earth elements, such as your windmills, your hybrid vehicles, to your modern military technologies, your laser-guided munitions, night vision goggles, and so on. In China, rare earth elements are given a lot of importance, and you can see this in some of their writing. I've seen them referred to as, for example, a treasure trove of new materials and the vitamins of modern industry. The key is China produces close to 90% of the world's supply of rare earths. Meanwhile, they possess about, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, about 48% of the world's reserves. So what's interesting, though, is that rare earth elements are really not rare, despite their name. They can be found throughout the Earth's crust. However, there are a number of challenges in finding and extracting them. One challenge, for example, is in finding them in high enough concentrations to make them economical enough to mine and produce. Another challenge is in the potential environmental impact associated with mining and producing them. Then finally, there's the challenge of separating out each element. And this process can actually take, I've been told several times, up to 1,000 steps as you move up the periodic table. A little bit of background. China's strategy behind its rare earth elements industry has evolved over the past 5 decades or so. Although the country's intentions of dominating the rare earth industry really didn't become apparent, nor the consequences realized until the last decade. And now the United States and other nations have been scrambling to try to turn the situation around. Bayanovo, which is China's largest rare earth mine, originally opened up as an iron ore mine. In the late 1950s, they began recovering rare earth minerals. About this time, the United States had been coming up with some really neat innovations that created, or that required rare earth elements. For example, europium. When television first came out with color, the red was really, really 65. So basically, we saw there was a growing market for some of these elements. In 1963, China established the Baotou Research Institute of Rare Earths. Today, this is the largest rare earth research and development institution in the world. By the 1960s, also, China had already had a really good foundation for potential success. When you look at it, the country possessed an abundance of supply. Global demand was increasing as new technologies using rare earth elements came online. And then also China's cheap labor, coupled with the fact that Bayanovo, their primary mine, the primary function of that mine was actually to serve as an iron ore mine. So the rare earth was a secondary product, making it much cheaper. Let's see, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms would mark a turning point to the rare earth elements industry as China began opening up to the rest of the world. Then in 1980s, China made a lot of progress in separation techniques, it's not just a matter of, well, I think I already mentioned that, of separating out the minerals, but separating out each individual element. Around this time frame, they also opened up 2 government-run state key laboratories. One is in Changcheng, which is in the northeastern province of Jilin, and the other is affiliated with Peking University in Beijing. And one of the prime things that these 2 key laboratories were trying to do, was the processing, and to make that better and better throughout the years. By the 1990s, China was able to separate out the rare earth elements and sell them at a very cheap price. And what this did was it caused China's exports to grow and worldwide prices to plunge, which literally drove the country's foreign competitors out of business, or at least significantly reduced, I know Molycorp, their production efforts. So now back to our model. Despite many nations having rare earth elements within their borders, the objective reality was that China had become the only nation mining and producing these rare earth elements. This gives the country the strategic advantage of ownership. This strategic advantage gives China the ability to further its goals through the subjective use of stratagems, such as blackmail, market manipulation, and you're going to learn more about this here in a minute, and the goal being complete domination. So next I'm going to talk about 2 really interesting examples that show you kind of China's stratagems, which would further elevate the country in the industry. In the first one, prior to the 1990s, Mountain Pass, which is a California-based rare earth mine, the only functioning mine right now in the United States, it was the biggest producer of rare earth elements. In 1978, Unocal purchased Molycorp. Unocal, which was a major petroleum exporter. And Molycorp was the company that owned Mountain Pass Mine. Then in 1982, Mountain Pass began processing samarium oxide. Samarium is the rare earth element that goes into the samarium cobalt magnet, which was developed in the 1970s. This magnet at the time was the strongest magnet on the market. It's a very important magnet for certain high-tech applications that fall within military and aviation and space industries, because it has what's called a high coercivity. This simply means that it's able to withstand very high temperatures without losing its magnetic properties. Well, in the early 80s, scientists came out then with the neodymium iron boron magnet, which today is the strongest magnet, stronger than the samarium cobalt magnet. And then in 1989, Mountain Pass began processing the neodymium oxide, kind of following the trend, to support, supply as the demand grew. In 2005, here's where it gets interesting, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation submitted an $18.5 billion cash bid for Unocal. You probably remember that. They outbid Chevron by $500 million. And this actually caused a huge media frenzy and a lot of concern within the energy industry because, like I said, Unocal was a major petroleum explorer. However, there was one underlying issue that people did not talk about, at least not publicly, and that is that if China owned Unocal, then it would also own Molycorp. And by doing so, China at the time would have had a complete monopoly over all the major rare earth element resources in the world. And I'm sure you probably remember that the sale never went through. So, but there was one significant and now highly regretted sale that did go through. In the early 1980s, during a conference, someone discussed some really unusual characteristics that they discovered when they put together neodymium and iron and boron, I believe. Anyway, scientists from General Motors and Hitachi, who were in the audience, they were sitting in the audience, right after that they raced back to their laboratories and found that neodymium, iron, boron created this superior permanent magnet. Well, each party then they put in for a patent, and there was this big fight that occurred, and they ended up with a compromise, splitting the patent rights. GM, which needed the magnets for their vehicles, created a division in 1986, which they called Magnequench. In 1995, the Beijing San Juan New Materials High-Tech Company, along with China National Non-Ferrous Metals Import and Export Corporation, both state-owned businesses, joined forces with Sextant Group, a U.S. investment firm founded by Archibald Cox, Jr., and they tried to acquire Magnequench. Well, at that time, the U.S. government is said to have stepped in, but they finally gave in. And they allowed the purchase to happen as long as China agreed to keep Magnequench in the United States for at least 5 years. Well, once that contract, the agreement had expired in 2002, according to my sources, the entire operation, along with all the equipment, simply disappeared. Let's see. This was actually huge. In less than 1 decade, the permanent magnet market went through a complete shift in leadership. In 1998, 90% of the world's magnet production was in the United States, Europe, and Japan. In the 1990s, China's total output of these magnets was about 2,600 tons. By 2007, the country's annual capacity rose to 80,000 tons. China had managed to completely capture and dominate the market. And this is of great concern because of many, many uses for these magnets in today's technologies. They're absolutely critical. Now, in an effort to gain a further foothold in the industry, China set out to move its position up the supply chain. In other words, the country recognized the importance of controlling and exporting more than just minerals. The ultimate goal had become to produce and export finished products. This generates more revenue and it provides more jobs to the Chinese. Okay, sorry. This particular illustration shows 2 different value chains, and the United States dependence. It's kind of a good compare and contrast. For example, we're dependent on the Middle East for crude oil. If you look at the top one, but we have the capacity to refine that crude oil. So really, our dependence falls, toward the beginning, at the natural resource, the resource itself. Well, in the case of rare earth elements, our dependence on China has been moving up the value chain. We used to depend on the country for just the minerals, but through China's extensive efforts, our dependence has been growing, moving up the chain. Their ultimate goal really is super high innovation, putting out. They want to be able to sell the most hybrid vehicles and so forth. So at this point, China had obtained major stakes in the rare earth elements industry and the magnets market. In 2005, one of China's stratagems was to begin cutting back export quotas of rare earths. Export quotas were reduced year after year. Now, while they were cutting back, they were also putting in place, or they had also put in place, a three-tiered cost structure. So, first, domestic companies within China are given top priority and the lowest cost for rare earth elements. The second priority, and somewhat more expensive, are for those foreign companies that move their operations to China. Finally, you have the rest of the world. The rest of the world pays the highest price for the rare earth materials, and they're also the last priority to receive them. So what this ends up doing is it forces foreign companies who need the rare earth to move their production bases to China. Now, all of this is really good for China because it brings in more jobs, which helps the economy. And by doing this, it also adds to social stability. People are happier. It also gives the country the ability and the revenues to increase research and development efforts. And so the cycle continues. Of course, what's good for China has not necessarily been good for the rest of us. China's move to force foreign manufacturers to move their operations there could actually result in the compromise of proprietary technologies. Meanwhile, we have become beholden to the country for more than just rare earth elements. As I said, we've been going up. Now it's really hard to get the actual rare earth elements. You have to buy the more finished products, the magnets. Then China's job opportunities would, by default, mean a reduction in our own job opportunities. Finally, while the U.S. was once the top innovator in applications using rare earth elements, we've seen a huge reduction in our research and development efforts. Meanwhile, China grows stronger. China now has control over an industry that could easily be used as a political or economic weapon. And actually, we've already witnessed this type of scenario. You may recall in 2010, there was a skirmish between a Chinese fishing trawler and the Japanese Coast Guard off the coast of the disputed Senkaku Islands. The Chinese fishing trawler rammed the Japanese Coast Guard vessel twice. They said it was an accident, but they rammed them twice. And the Japanese Coast Guard ended up apprehending the captain of the fishing trawler. After the Chinese government demanded that Japan release the captain, and Japan refused, saying that they insisted that they first wanted to conduct a full investigation. Well, China imposed a de facto ban on rare earth exports to Japan. This move created a lot of concern because Japan is the second largest consumer of Chinese rare earth elements. China is the #1 consumer. The Japanese economy is heavily dependent on producing and exporting high-tech products that contain rare earth elements. So basically, without these important materials, the Japanese economy would take a really, really big hit. So it goes. The object of the strategic thought process is to take a look at the landscape. China has a rare earth industry, and no one else really does. So the question China might be asking itself is, well, how do I use this to my benefit? The United States, which used to be the biggest producer of rare earths, stepped down over a decade. Japan wants and needs rare earths. Judging by many of China's actions, it's almost as if somebody's sitting back and asking himself, how can we manipulate this? So again, this is just one way of looking at China's role in the rare earth industry. There are other ways to look at it. Would one day be diminished, as well as concerns over the negative environmental impact caused by developing them. But I should also point out that China's stratagems are not unique to the rare earth elements. You can see how the country's manipulated the system in other scenarios. More recently, if you look at Caterpillar, the company which moved its production to China back in the 70s. I think they were the first one to move to do this right after China opened up to the rest of the world. they were hoping to capture the Chinese market, instead trying to maintain positive ties. The company shared some of its technologies with a dozen state-owned Chinese companies, and they ended up losing out to Chinese competitors, which seemed to have suspiciously similar technologies that came out. Most recently, the company, after already locking in an $800 million deal to buy a mining company in China, found out that there was some account misconduct or something. I don't know all the details, but one problem that Caterpillar is now finding is that they have sunk so much money into it that to simply pick up and move out of China would result in the loss of substantial time, money, and technology. So if you're interested in learning more about rare earth elements, here are some of the things that I've put out. The first one I always recommend, it's the most comprehensive, China's rare earth elements industry, what can the West learn? I think it kind of broke the story on rare earth elements. Let's see, and then also I would like to recommend, if you want to read more about the geostrategy or Chinese strategic thinking, you might want to take a look at Geothinking Like the Chinese, a Potential Explanation of China's Geostrategy by my colleague Tim Thomas. And with that, I guess that's it, unless there are any questions.
Thank you, Sandy. That was great. Hey, while people are typing in their questions, I have one, and this is certainly as someone who's not very well read on the subject. But you talked about this mining company and the perceived dominance of the Chinese at this effort. You mentioned Molycorp, and what other companies or countries are being dominant in this? I think I read something about Australia. How does this affect the balance of power that seems to be Chinese emphasis?
Oh, okay. So you're trying to find out who some of the competitors or who some of the mining companies trying to come up, or who? Because right now we have we do have Molycorp. We also have Australia has a couple of companies. Let's see, Linus is the most predominant one, and Mount Weld is is the name of their mine. They've been going through actually a lot of issues because the Australian government told Mount Weld, or excuse me, the Australian government said, sure, you can mine these rare earth elements, but we want them processed. We don't want them processed in our territory. I guess there's a lot of fear associated, and there's a lot that goes into trying to make sure that everything's done to protect the environment. And so they set up their shop in Malaysia, and the Malaysians have been speaking out and making it really, really tough. I understand that right now it's all set up and it's operational, I believe, and they are taking they've been granted a 2-year license to make sure that it's not going to have any environmental impact. So rather than giving them a 10-year contract or license to do, that way, after 2 years, if it doesn't work out, they can always pull out. So there are also, I know in South Africa, I believe there's a mine, and they've got a number of them. In fact, I think at some point I heard there was like in the 200s or 300s. Numbering, junior mines trying to start these mines, but the difficulty really is when starting these mines. You can easily mine the minerals, but then the trick is in how are you going to actually process out the rare earth elements? It's very costly. It's very complex, and so, like I said, it's just not a very easy process. Many want to do it, but I don't see very many. I think just a handful are going to actually make it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, it was quite a bit more than I was expecting. If we can just hold on for just a second, while we get some more questions brought in here. While you're entering your questions into the chat box down below, I'd like to draw your attention to the Kansas University is having a conference on the 10th of April. It's Russia and China, the architects of a new global order, big question mark. And it's going to be a very interesting all-day conference. A lot of good speakers lined up. You can find information about that at crees.ku.edu, crees.ku.edu. And so, okay, let me get back to the question here. I'm a student researching the possible link between rare earth mineral mining and a resource curse, similar to that attributed to oil. I am having trouble finding data on the profits that China is making from the rare earth industry. Do you know if and where any data regarding revenue from rare earth minerals is available, or perhaps at least what the quantities being mined and are processed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't have the exact answers myself, but I might be able to point you to somebody who might be able to help you. TMR, his name is Gareth Hatch, and he really gets into the nitty-gritty aspects of the industry. Gareth, Gareth, and then Hatch, HATCH. And like I said, I think the company is called TMR, and I'm sure, or you, if you can't get a hold of him, just you can reach me through the CKC lecture series, and I'll be happy to pass that on to you. I hope he doesn't mind that I just gave his name away, but he's extremely knowledgeable.